Let's first focus on what it means to be static or dynamic and how we can kind of figure out which routes in our application are which. So to figure that out, I'm going to go back over to my terminal and I'm going to run that npm run build command again. When we run that command, after it's all done, we're going to get that nice pretty output at the very end. Yeah, this right here. And I want you to take a look at these little icons that we have next to each route. Those kind of look like they are just pretty bullet points, but they actually convey a lot more information than that. Okay. So whenever we run npm run build, we're going to get that output, and the symbols we see next to each route tells us what Next thinks about each of the different routes we have added into our application. Whenever we see a little circle like that, that means that Next thinks that we have a route that contains static data. Because this is a static route, the default behavior, again, this is the default, and we can kind of configure it and tweak it a little bit. Next is going to render that page one time right now at build time, and then serve out that HTML file to everyone. So it's a process I just explained in the last video. If we have a little lambda symbol, however, as we do on snippets/id and snippets ID edit, that means that Next thinks that our route is dynamic. These dynamic routes are going to behave a little bit more closer to how you might expect a traditional web application to work. So whenever someone comes to our application and makes a request, Next is going to render that page and send the result back to that person. So now the big question becomes, well, how does Next decide what a static route is and what a dynamic route is? All pages by default are static. In order to become a dynamic route, we have to do one of a couple of different things inside of that route. So these are all things we can do to make a page dynamic. A lot of different things here, and you really do not need to memorize all of them. Instead, the best way to handle this is to run that npm run build command every now and then, take a look at the output, and then do a little bit of research into understanding, okay, this route right now is static or it's dynamic. I want it to be something else, and then figure out what you're doing to make it dynamic. So again, I'm going to list out some of these things, but you really do not need to memorize them. The first set of things we can do inside of a page that's going to make it into a dynamic route is to modify cookies. So we could do cookies.set, cookies.delete. If we also tried to use anything tied to a query string, such as access a query string inside of a server component through a prop that is automatically passed to our components, that's going to turn our route into a dynamic route. We can also force a route to be dynamic by setting what's called a route segment configuration. These are very specifically named variables that we can export from our page files. For example, if we go back over to our home page, and up here at the top, if we just write in export const dynamic is force dynamic, that's going to tell Next that regardless of what else is going on inside of this page, we want this thing to be considered to be a dynamic route. And that means it will not be built up at build time and then just reserved again and again. After adding that change, we can save this, rerun npm run build, and then after a brief pause, when we see this output, there we go, there we go, there we go. We'll see on the home page, there it is right there. Now this is considered to be a dynamic route. We can also set a very similar option of revalidate equals 0. The way in which we fetch data can also change whether a route is static or dynamic. We have not made use of the fetch function just yet, but we will very shortly. And some of the different options that we pass to the fetch function to fetch our data is going to turn our route into a dynamic route. And then finally, here's the big one. This is going to occur in a lot of your applications anytime that you use a dynamic path. So that is a path where you've got one of those wildcards in it. That's going to automatically, by default, turn this into a dynamic route. In our case, we've got the wildcard for ID right there and right there. And that's why two of our routes, we flip back over. We zoom out a little bit. That's why both of our show and edit routes right here end up as being dynamic. It's because they are using that little wildcard. So that's what's going to determine whether we have a static or a dynamic route. Now, the next thing we're going to take a look at is, okay, we've got a static route and maybe we want a static route because at the end of the day, it's not the worst thing in the world. We do kind of want caching because it does dramatically improve the performance of our application. But at some point in time, even if we have a static route, we kind of have to accept that our data is going to change. from where it is when we first build our application and get it ready for production. So we need some way of kind of updating this cached HTML file. That's going to be the next thing we take a look at.